Our guest in the chair today is Phil Trendall. Phil spent most of his working life as an officer in the British Transport Police and was involved in response to many major incidents, including terrorist attacks and threats. He performed various command roles at most of the large train crashes, for example Potter's Bar, Hatfield and Greyrig. And for 8 years he led the counter-terrorism work of the British Transport Police. Amongst many other consultancy roles he's an associate lecturer here at the EPC. Phil, thank you for joining me. You're giving a talk here at the EPC called Multi-Agency Working at the Tactical and Strategic Level. Just how easy is it to get the agencies to work together?
I think it's quite a mouthful, but it's actually what the UK does best. I think before we talk about anything in detail on that subject, we have to acknowledge that it is a field in which the UK leads. I'm always shocked when I work overseas at things that we have really put behind us. It doesn't mean, of course, that we can't do it better. And that's what sessions like we're having today are about, is making sure that we move forward with that and build on the success so far.
And has that joint working improved over the years? Has it got even better in the UK?
Without any shadow of doubt, it has. It is the starting point for most work done post-incident, and indeed in terms of preparation. There is an assumption about amongst those people who work in civil protection that a multi-agency approach and a multi-partnered approach will be necessary. But like everything else, there's still more that can be done.
The Civil Contingencies Act, when it came in, did that improve working together? Has that made any differences to it?
Well, I think it formalised it, and many people at the time were of the opinion, well, actually, we don't need to be told that we do this together. I think we can go back further and look at things such as the Clapham rail accident in the late 80s, where comment was made there about the interagency working between the various partners. But what has happened, particularly since the CCA came in, is a growing importance of partners other than the blue light services, and that's a very positive development.
When you've got all these partners working together, what are the barriers to it? Are there some problems? Everyone's got this different jargon. Does that cause problems? The language that people use?
Well, I think first and foremost we've got to say there's a big difference between having a doctrine that says that we will have a multi-agency approach and turning that into reality. So if the big remaining challenge is making that real. And the barriers that sometimes get in the way of that are, first of all, an understanding that just because we're partners doesn't mean that people are coming from these incidents and these plans from the same perspective. Different agencies have different priorities, and that's absolutely fine. But what we don't want is to have a situation where cooperation is there on the surface, but underneath the underlying tensions cause problems. So that really in this country becomes a massive issue. But what we do need to do is to make sure that partnership is real. And one of the fundamental elements in any partnership is acknowledging that there will be difficulties and tensions. Success comes from being able to bounce back from those tensions. And whether that's in the immediate post-event crisis stage and response stage, or whether it's at the planning or the other end of the spectrum, the recovery stage, it's important to have the resilience to be able to bounce back into those relationships. There's another issue, and a lot of work has been done in things like jargon around the JESIP programme, the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability programme, and things that have flowed since the inquest into 7/7. So jargon does remain an issue, but it's also and always comes back to that willingness to engage between partners. Some institutions have a culture that encourages that and see that as second nature. But we have to move beyond the individual situation where people in relationships generally are between individuals. Individuals move on, things develop. What we actually want to have is a strategic expectation that people will meaningfully engage both before events and when they've happened.
One of the things, I don't know if this does happen, but if you've got emergency services working as partners and they've got that sort of joint working, how then, in the picture, how do people like health and environment and all the others responders, the Cat 1 and Cat 2 responders, how do they fit into that interagency working?
Well,
is it as easy for them?
It's not as easy for them, particularly if we look at the pressures on local authorities and the multitasking that occurs within local authorities and the boundaries that occur. That does not mean that most local authorities are not absolutely dedicated to making that happen. And the work of local resilience forums to bring that about, and particularly a lot of the detailed work that takes place under the main strategic level forums, attribute to that. There are difficulties sometimes in engaging organisations that do not have a big footprint necessarily in that area. So the national agencies, for example, who will play a very large role post-event, who may not have a big footprint pre-event, to make sure that their voice is heard. There are particular challenges, I think, and where I would like to see, or where I think we could do better, and that is understanding the absolute pressure and demands put on people in crisis who are chairing, for example, tactical coordinating groups or even strategic coordinating groups. It requires particular skill. It requires not just a knowledge of your own organisation and some knowledge of others, but it's involving things such as active listening, making sure that some other agencies who may have a key piece of the jigsaw get their say, and recognising, of course, that different agencies have very different cultures. And as we've seen in some events, as it moves towards the recovery phase, the emergency services approach, which is fairly well disciplined and directive, as is necessary in the response phase, is no longer appropriate as things move on. So I would like to see, and I enjoy working with organisations that are actively training for those roles, for the chairmanship role.
Yeah, so training is important then. When you haven't got a crisis ongoing, you need to make sure that when it does happen, the people involved, they have had the training.
And it's not a surprise to them to understand some of the personal testimony that has come from people who have led those groups, both at strategic and tactical level, and understanding some of the lessons that are very, very necessary. And the person that shouts loudest in a meeting, as we know from our daily lives, isn't necessarily the person that's got the most useful contribution to make. Translating that into a meeting in a particular set of circumstances, those skills can be developed, and it's good to see that being incorporated into courses for the emergency services and indeed for others, to practice it in that context.
Practice is vital then.
Yes, absolutely.
So is it practice, is it training? How could you make the improvements? How could you get the agencies to work even better together? You say in the UK they work well now. How could it be even better?
I think by finding the space and time for people who are pretty senior in their organisations, for tactical command and certainly for strategic command, to not only exercise around things that might happen, but exercising and the mechanism for running groups. And that's not just about scenario-based training, it's about scenario-based exercise, and it's also about training for the skills required to be a member of one of those groups.
You were saying things like active listening and things like that. Active
listening, making sure that that there is a economy of contribution, which is, I think, rather a polite way of putting it sometimes, and understanding that different agencies, people operating at a high level of emotion and tension. They are doing what they're trained to do in terms of their command of the incident, but in the middle of all of that, you have to engender a spirit which allows people to come to clear decisions that cross lines. And in a world where reorganisation is something that seems to happen to everybody every day, and some of our biggest organisations and biggest players have been subject, obviously, to considerable retrenchment in recent years, to find time to, one, find out about your partners in advance, not just meet with them, but find out what they do. What does a local authority do? Well, as a ratepayer, using a very old language, but as a council taxpayer, you have an idea what a local authority does. But actually, as somebody who might chair a tactical or strategic group, it's probably worth finding out exactly what they do and what they can't do. So the provision of services may be structured in such a way that it's done by a third-party provider. Understanding health, understanding what health can do and can't do, rather than just working on assumptions.
And rather than just finding out when the crisis happens.
Yes.
Yes.
Or working on the assumption much longer until you find that assumption is no longer tenable.
Yeah. So communication between
Yes.
the agencies, ongoing,
Absolutely.
all the time.
Yes.
Yeah, is vital.
And seeing it as a core skill, particularly for the emergency services who be often, and for local authorities who be chairing both of these groups potentially, and certainly moving into the recovery phase.
Now, your interest in emergency planning started, I think, over 30 years ago when you were a student, and you researched arrangements for air raid precautions in the period leading up to the Second World War. Is there anything from that you learned all those years ago and what we learned before the Second World War that is still relevant today in how you prepare?
Well, of course, they were extraordinary times, and when people are faced with the enormity of a major incident or an emergency, it can be very overwhelming, and I think it's quite worthwhile sometimes just to replay things and consider the scenarios that people were discussing at the end of the 30s, where the assumptions around casualty figures, for example, were absolutely huge, much larger than they turned out to be for civilian bombing, for example. And our predecessors did stand up and did deal with those things and had processes in place. They didn't have computers, they didn't have email, and some people might say that's no bad thing, but they did have a massive challenge and they rose to the occasion. It was also a time where planning was very highly valued. We speak now about community resilience. Well, the role of air raid precautions actually, of course, was community. Anybody who's ever watched Dad's Army will know that it is a community-based activity. So there are certain resonances, but also there's an obligation, I think, historically, for us to learn from previous incidents as professionals in the field and not just rely on the last incident or the incident before. This year sees the anniversary of the Moorgate disaster in 1975. In fact, that's just a couple of days away in the end of February. It's the 100th anniversary of the Quinton's Hill train crash, for example. And in civilian services, we're sometimes a little bit reluctant or slow to try and draw lessons from previous incidents. And it's quite refreshing when you work with the military and you see they're quite happy to learn lessons from the Battle of Waterloo or the Battle of Trafalgar, if they are still relevant. And that longitudinal view of managing issues, I think we would benefit from. And indeed, some things just never change.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks ever so much, Phil.
Thank you.